Welcome to Chaos Orchestra. This is episode number 6, Knowledge Democratization and Abstract Wikipedia. In Wikipedia itself, knowledge democratization is currently defined as the acquisition and spread of knowledge amongst a wider part of the population, and not just privileged elites as clergy and academics. Nowadays, the speed of knowledge aggregation and spread rose to an unprecedented level, which can be a curse and a blessing at the same time. Today, we're going to talk to Denny Vrandečić, who is head of special projects at Wikimedia Foundation, former ontologist for the Google Knowledge Graphs, and the founder of Croatian Wikipedia. We're going to discuss topics like collective intelligence, the future of Wikipedia, limitations of knowledge graphs and graph natural language hybrid systems, as well as the social challenges of knowledge democratization. As usual, I hope you enjoy the conversation.
It has been around since 2001. In fact, Wikipedia is having its 20th birthday this year. But for the first few years, it was not well known. So around 2004, 5, 6, this is when Wikipedia really took off in the public consciousness. This is when articles came out about comparing it with Encyclopedia Britannica and all these other things. So around that time, also a number of projects started, which were about making the knowledge which was encoded in Wikipedia more readable, more accessible, more structured. And those projects involved DBpedia, which was a project started by a German research institute. It was Søren Auer was there, Chris Beetzer and others. And they had the idea of taking the info boxes of Wikipedia and extracting those as structured information and providing this data back as in semantic web standards like RDF and similar. And this was a brilliant idea, and it led to a lot of development and a lot of applications working with this data. And a similar approach was taken by Freebase, which was a platform started by a startup company in the Bay Area called MetaWeb, and they took the idea even further by not just extracting from Wikipedia, but taking a lot of different sources and reconciling them together into a large data set. Freebase was later bought by Google and became the core of what then turned into the Google Knowledge Graph a few years later, which is now used for, among many other things, for answering questions when you are asking questions to the Google search engine, and also for bringing data together from many different places of Google. We were also around the same time suggesting something we call semantic Wikipedia. The idea that basically the contributors themselves would mark up part of their templates or part of their content inside of Wikipedia to make the information easier accessible for machine processing. And this led to a software called Semantic MediaWiki, which was an extension to the MediaWiki software that Wikipedia runs on. And it was actually widely used and still is widely used. For example, a lot on the US intelligence use it. So there's the semantic wiki is used by the CIA, the NSA, and all those things. NASA is using it. A number of museums and archives and libraries are using it. The MoMA in New York City is using it, for example. And many other places are using semantic MediaWiki. It basically extends the wiki in a way that allows to annotate some of its information, so that it makes it easier to access this information, to ask queries to the information inside the wiki, which is enormously helpful, for example, for internal knowledge management, and for creating kind of small applications on the fly. You can get a list of all the departments in your organization if they're in the wiki. You can, who is reporting to who, what is the project and the process on. Sorry, what is the progress on different projects and stuff like this?
Would it be correct to say that Wikipedia is a huge crowdsourced knowledge graph that reflects encyclopedic knowledge?
depends on your definition of knowledge graph. The term knowledge graph, as it's used today, hasn't been around when Wikipedia started. Wikipedia is a crowdsourced encyclopedia. It has a lot of knowledge, and some of a small sliver of this knowledge has been made machine readable through projects like Wikipedia, Freebase, and even Wikidata later.
Does something exist like a graph that represents all the relations by the links and all the entities in Wikipedia, which in the end would we might call a knowledge graph?
So Wikidata is the closest to that. Wikidata is a knowledge graph that reflects Wikipedia, but it certainly doesn't contain all the links that are in Wikipedia, and it definitely doesn't contain all the knowledge that is in Wikipedia. There's a lot of knowledge which just doesn't really fit into a knowledge graph. What Wikidata has is, on the one side, it has actually many more entities than there are Wikipedia articles. But on the other side also, it only has a very small subset of the connections between all these entities. Basically, the ones that are easily to capture inside of a knowledge graph. These are the ones that make it to Wikidata.
So, Denny, I know it's a hard question, but what would you say, what share of Wikipedia is machine readable and what share is not machine readable yet?
If you ask how much of the knowledge that is inside of Wikipedia is easily accessible through an API, basically this is how I interpret your question.
Yeah.
If you would ask me to put a number to that, I would put that number in the low single digit of percentages. So like maybe 3 to 4%, maybe less. Very likely not more. So I think we're really just at the beginning of getting the knowledge that is currently in Wikipedia in a format that is easily accessible to any form of program or machine.
Are there any running projects in order to make more of this knowledge machine readable?
Oh, sure. I mean, that's basically the holy grail of knowledge representation. Yes, there are plenty of projects that are trying to capture more of that. And there are questions like, how do we represent this knowledge? What do these representations mean? How far does the semantics have to really capture what we mean with those things? And then how much of, even if we create stronger formalisms, more expressive formalisms, how do we actually get the knowledge out of Wikipedia into those formalisms? And the other way around, how make we, once we have the knowledge represented in those expressive formalisms, how do we make it usable by readers, by people who want to use this kind of knowledge? In what ways do we can we use this kind of knowledge? So there are so many things that we currently can do. For example, even starting with very simple things, like if something in the world changes, say one pope retires and a new pope comes in, how do we find all the places in Wikipedia that need to be updated? Right? If we had this all as machine-readable knowledge, this would be trivial, right? It would be easy to solve. It's not. It's very hard. Or other question like, okay, we have 100 different articles about the city of Berlin, right, or the city of Munich in different languages. Which aspects are represented differently in the different languages? That's a very difficult question. We have no idea. I mean, we have some ideas on how to get there, but we're far away from really answering this question easily. We have machine learned methods that are trying to capture that, and they do a decent job, but they're still far away from really capturing all of it. And the current approaches, I would say the last 10, 15 years, are probably all around using machine learned methods, using neural methods to answer this kind of questions, and to understand what is actually the content inside the Wikipedias, and to make that accessible.
So the target is not just to create a search engine or to let the user search for a place where he can find an answer, but to actually represent the knowledge in a way where you can give him answers directly?
That would be the ultimate goal, right? I mean, this is the goal of really answering the question and making it actionable, making it really usable. And and we're not there yet. We do this for a very small sliver of possible questions, but for many, we are still very far away from that. Now, your question comes pretty much to the core of what Abstract Wikipedia, the new project that I'm working on, is trying to get to. So Abstract Wikipedia has the goal of extending the expressivity of what Wikidata can say far beyond of what knowledge graphs usually can do. And there are so many things that we can easily express with natural language, but that are really hard to capture in a knowledge graph. So one of my favorite examples is just, let's go to the Marie Curie article. And in her biography, you will find a paragraph or two talking about her relationship with Pierre Curie. And you find information like, for example, that Marie Curie really didn't want to stay in France. She wanted to go back to Poland to work there, but she couldn't get a job there because sexism was still very wide and still is today in academia. So she couldn't land a job in Poland, and Pierre was trying to convince her to come back to Paris. She then convinced him to actually have his own PhD, and she came also back. But there's a lot of things happening. In the end, they marry. And she marries in what later becomes the blue dress that she uses in her laboratory as a working dress and so on. And there's so much information going on there, which is really, really hard to capture in triples in a knowledge graph and so on. Like that she wished to go back to Poland, that he tried to convince her, that and all these things. And natural language is wonderful at capturing that, obviously. And stories are a super important element to capture this kind of things that are happening, to capture the narrative of these things. And knowledge graphs are terrible at capturing narratives and stories. Knowledge graphs are based on the idea that knowledge can be composed in little declarative pieces of knowledge, and that the order of knowledge doesn't matter at all, which is true for a machine, right? If you are looking for the answer of a Sparkle query, if you're trying just, to create a table that answers a specific question, you don't really care about the order of those things. But we as humans, when we are reading it, if I would be reading all the facts that are in Wikipedia in an arbitrary order, I wouldn't get anywhere, right? This would be extremely confusing. What we really need are stories which are tying the events, which are tying what we're describing into things that we already know, so that we actually can understand it, grasp it, learn it, that we can ourselves change and adapt to the knowledge that we're learning about. And it's not just about, the biography of people. The same thing is true for very technical and scientific terms. If you think about the article about photosynthesis, for example, photosynthesis is hard to understand if you would break it down into declarative single atomic sentences. It's much more understood if you describe it as, sunlight is coming in, the plant is taking has receptors for some forms of the sunlight, they're turning it into energy, they then store the energy in specific chemical compounds. This is happening by those chemical reactions here. And so the order of the narrative makes a huge difference for us as humans in order to understand the thing. If I would be telling you those facts in a random order, you would have huge trouble of piecing the pieces together and understanding what's going on. And knowledge graphs are not very good at that. And they don't have to be, because it's not what they are there for, right? We have already something that is really good at this, which is natural language. So the idea in Abstract Wikipedia is basically to stay much closer to natural language, to take the lessons, to take the expressivity that natural language already covers, and abstract away the accidents of the individual natural languages and try to capture this essential information as notation, so that we can in turn use this as the starting point for generating natural language in different natural languages have a single place where we store the information, the content of an article, and then allow this to be translated into as many as 300 different languages that Wikipedia supports, and allow the individual Wikipedias then to use the generated text in order to fill in the places where they currently have gaps. So this is the goal we are aiming at. And this is a very different goal than making all of this knowledge machine understandable, of making it accessible to the machine, because we actually still don't understand the semantics of what we're saying. We're just able to turn it into natural language. But we can't, for example, automatically say, oh yeah, actually what we're having here is in contradiction to what is being stated in that article, or similar things. We still can't do that, actually. We can only turn it into natural language. We might be getting closer to a place where we can access all of these content, but we're definitely not there yet. And this is why I think that this project, even though it's ambitious, is doable, because we're not trying to understand the whole of what can be said, that we are trying to understand the whole of natural language. We're just trying to find a notation that allows us to generate natural language text. And the heavy lifting of understanding the content is still done by the reader. They're still the one who are actually interpreting it and turning it into meaningful content.
So, I mean, there's this dilemma, right, between natural language that is highly expressive and can capture a lot of nuances, and machine-readable representations like knowledge graphs. And so you're trying to find something in between that focuses more on generating natural language from whatever was described in this abstract Wikipedia way. So how would you solve the problem, for example, of changes over time? I mean, if any change might cause a chain of different conflicts, right? So would abstract Wikipedia help with this too?
It would help, but it wouldn't solve it. It would help in the sense that you have to make the change only in one place, and it will be propagated to all the different language editions that Wikipedia has. But it wouldn't be automatic in the sense that you can just tell the system, you know, something like, a new US president was elected, go ahead and make all the changes. This is not what would happen, right? We would still have humans to actually filter the world, to see what is changing, and then go and do the changes on the content. But the one big difference is those changes would now propagate to all the Wikipedia language editions that participate in that common set of knowledge. So right now the situation is that you have to go in all the different language editions and make an update to each single one of them, because every language edition article is completely independent from the other ones. And I did an analysis about 2 years ago, which is probably very much outdated by now, which was just looking at San Francisco. So San Francisco had a change in the mayor, and was like trying to see, okay, how many of the articles about San Francisco in the different language editions have the mayor updated? And what I found was pretty interesting. So first, there were about 150 language editions that have an article about San Francisco at all. About half of them mentioned the mayor. And so I'm talking now about a situation that's about a year after the mayor became mayor. And a year after the mayor became mayor, the vast majority of articles still had a previous mayor as their mayor. So it was still not updated. But it wasn't just, you know, not updated, it was the previous one. Sometimes it was the one before that. Sometimes it was the one before that. Sometimes the data was up to 10 or 15 years old. The most surprising one was there was one language edition that listed a mayor from the 1970s. I was like, Wikipedia didn't even exist back then. How did that happen? Like, I mean, so none of them was wrong in the sense that they listed someone who never was mayor. Like, none of them named someone else, but a lot of them were just out of date. And a good part of those who were not out of date were actually not out of date because they were using the information directly from Wikidata. So in Wikidata, you already can say the mayor of San Francisco is London Breed. And then all the Wikipedias who use that can just update automatically. So those were already up to date, obviously. But a lot of them were not. So it's not that they're like wrong, that they're just out of date. And the Abstract Wikipedia proposal would help with keeping more languages comprehensive, which also means you can actually be free to add this kind of information, because you don't have to worry, well, who will be around to actually update it in a few years. So if you now go and say, you go to let's say the Georgian Wikipedia article about San Francisco, and you add the, oh, actually a better example, sorry. So let's say you go to the Sami version of San Francisco and enter there the mayor of San Francisco. And in fact, one of the earliest Wikipedias to be up to date about the mayor of San Francisco was indeed the Sami language edition. And I was like, why Sami? This doesn't make much sense. Like, they were earlier than, I think, French and Spanish or whatever. Like, why that one? And the thing was, well, the article about San Francisco was just created right now. And therefore they kept it up to date. I'm pretty sure that the next time the mayor changes, it won't be up to date that quickly. It happened that this article was created at this point, and this is why it was up to date. So some languages like English were updating immediately, Wikidata updated basically immediately, and a small number of languages like French, German, and so on updated within a month. But other language editions took forever to update, and many of them are still not up to date. So this part, Abstract Wikipedia can help with. But we would still not be at a point where, you can say a random change in the world and it will propagate for all the articles. This is something that will be easier with Abstract Wikipedia, but won't be happening automatically.
So basically, Abstract Wikipedia is the ultimate technology to synchronize the different versions based on the languages in Wikipedia, right? Because they actually come from the same source. Yeah, can you maybe elaborate on how a user who wants to provide content would do that with Abstract Wikipedia?
Right. Yeah. So this is one of the things that worry me a lot. Because right now, the editing of Wikipedia is kind of easy. A user comes in, sees an article, sees a mistake, or sees something is missing. They click on edit. They see something that more or less resembles the output. It's natural language text and so on, with a little bit of markup. They go in and edit it. They click on publish. It's there. That's a wonderful workflow. This is, I think, what made Wikipedia grow to where it is. Basically, it's so easy to go in and edit. Now, with Abstract Wikipedia, we really have to work on the UX that makes sure that we don't make this much harder. So we still need to figure out how exactly that is. In the end, I still want to be in the situation that someone reads the article, sees there's a mistake, clicks on edit, and gets to a user interface where they figure out as easily as with the current one, how to actually make the update. But now the content is all, structured data and information, and it's using schematas and slots and all these things. So we really will have a challenge in in making the UX right to actually allow for that. We are thinking about possibly, introducing features where people can, make annotations on that stuff and saying, oh, this is out of date, it should be this and this in natural language. So, and then someone else comes in and creates actually the update. But really the ultimate goal would be to make the UX so intuitive and easy to use that they actually can make those changes themselves. Whether we will succeed, ask me in 2 years, I really don't know yet.
So what would be this ultimate UX? Would it be drawing the content, or how would it look like?
So we have currently a number of different UX ideas flowing through. So some of it is basically, you have things like a form-based representation of the content, and you can drag and drop pieces in and out. You can click into it. You can then edit individual pieces. And you always see, let's say you speak 2 or 3 languages, you choose those 2 or 3 languages, you see what would be the output of those, and then you can go in and fiddle around until you get to the output in those 2 or 3 languages that you speak. And if that looks right, the hope is it will be also right for the rest of the languages that you support. Another way is to actually indeed use just natural language text, and then let you edit the natural language text and then have a classifier running over that, a machine learning classifier that basically creates the abstract representation in the middle. And then you still can go in and edit that one and fiddle around with it. You see the results again in the languages that you support. But you start with natural language at the one end and try to fiddle through it. Those are some of the ideas that we have. It really depends on what kind the error is. If it's just a birthday is wrong or a place of birth can be more specific or whatever, that's something that I can totally see will be easily fixable by people without much training or anything. But if they want to go in and change the reasons why World War II has happened, this is something that I could imagine will remain challenging with the interface, particularly in order to allow this editing to happen across all the languages that we support. So one important thing is that the editing won't be English only. The editing will happen in all the languages simultaneously. So you can go in and edit in Hebrew and never even think about it. The system actually displays anything in English and be able to make those changes. Or you can go in and do it in Persian. You can do it in Amharic. And you don't need to speak any of the other languages, but you will still work on the same knowledge base and work on the same abstract content. And then it will be propagated to all the different languages through the generation.
But how is this knowledge base represented? So if it's a not particularly knowledge graph.
So the current idea is basically that we're using something like frames that have been developed by the University of Berkeley with people there. And so frames are named constructs that have slots and look a lot like function calls actually. So you have like a function, you have different arguments. So in a frame you have, for example, a frame that says is located in, this might be your frame, and then you have subject and object as a slot, and then you can have, for example, temporary modifiers as another slot, and then you can say, for example, a company like Tesla has moved from has been in California until 2020, but has moved to Texas in 2021, and so on. So you would have this kind of frames like located in, and then have the different slots in it and the fillers for those. And the fillers are either entities directly taken from Wikidata, or they are descriptions of entities which don't have a representation, that don't have a node in our knowledge graph. To come back to the Marie Curie example, the blue dress that she was wearing in her laboratory very likely doesn't have a Wikidata identifier, but you can create a description talking about, the dress of Marie Curie that is blue, that was worn that was a laboratory gown, and then use this as an entity which is, just created by its description and then used as a filler for the slots that we have in the frames.
Okay, so if I understand it correctly, this abstract Wikipedia is more than just a knowledge graph. It's enhanced by this time dimension, by this causalities, and even by descriptions that consist of things that don't have identifiers.
I would actually not even say this is a continuation necessarily of knowledge graph, but rather it's looking back at knowledge bases before knowledge graphs and the features that those had. And they were actually, so we're just actually making a step back from knowledge graphs and not really necessarily running forward. Yeah, but you already identified two of the main differences, narration and description by reference. The third difference that we usually count is redundancy. Redundancy is something that knowledge graphs usually try to avoid. They prefer to have normalized representation, but natural language is full of redundant information. And particularly if you read a text, almost most of it that you read is actually redundant with the bigger corpus of text. And that's okay. That's actually super important for us humans to actually understand. If we would be only reading non-redundant text, it would be super hard actually to understand that. And we need to also to cover basically this redundancy aspect. So those are the three main differences that we have identified to current knowledge graphs. First, the representation of narrative structure. Second, the representation of entities by description. And third, the representation of redundant information.
But wouldn't it be possible to represent these things with in RDF format and make it still machine readable?
Oh, absolutely. You can represent everything in RDF. That's not the issue. The issue is that knowledge graphs usually have further restrictions on them to make them easier to process by the software that's using them. So sure, I mean, in the end, a graph, in fact, the representation that we will have will be even just a tree, which means a tree with references outside, which basically means it is a graph. So in the end, it is a graph. But think about this. Take, for example, a piece of code. Take a function or whatever, or a Java code base. You can totally translate that into RDF, right? You can turn it into, say, well, we have objects. Those objects belong to those. So we have classes. Those classes belong to those packages. The packages have the following structure, and in those classes we have the following functions and static members, and the members have the following names. They are of the following types. The functions have the following code. The code is then a sequence. Sequences are a bit hard to represent, but it's possible. I mean, RDF has means to represent sequences, so you can say the following lines of code happen one after the other, and yada yada. All of these things. This is what an AST in the end does, right? You have an abstract syntax tree. You take some code, you translate it into an abstract syntax tree, and then your compiler works on top of that. And obviously, you could represent this RDF and have that. So you can definitely represent this as RDF. You can represent Abstract Wikipedia as RDF, and we probably will have also an export in RDF. The question is, how useful will it be, and for what? So, you know, having your code as RDF allows for certain queries to be super useful, but given the fact that most IDEs don't do that, but have rather different ways to process your code and allow you for refactorings and so on, indicates that maybe the graph is not necessarily the most effective way to represent the knowledge in this for this kind of things. And this might be the same for narrative texts as we are aiming for here. So there's maybe, I mean, I'm pretty sure there's a reason why IDEs haven't done that. On the other side, it might be super instructive, for example, to look at Mozilla. In around early 2000s, they wanted to switch Mozilla basically to be a browser on top of a RDF knowledge base. And basically, they're trying to turn everything into RDF, like the bookmarks inside of the system, all the user settings, the way that the browser was displaying things, your contacts inside your browser, all the information about you, and then the idea was, you know, if everything is represented inside the browser as RDF, and then your browser goes over the web, and the web is also full of RDF annotations, and it brings it in, and basically you already have this amazing interface that allows you to look at the web through your personalized lens, mixing your own data with what is learning from the web and displaying those things. I think this is a brilliant idea, but it didn't work out, as we know. And now the question is, why didn't it work out? And I don't have an answer for that. It's just that at some point, turning everything into RDF doesn't seem to be, yeah, for some reason it didn't work out. I'm really having a hard time to actually express why. It's just, it leads to development problems, you know. There are issues of speed, there are issues of developers not really getting behind the idea, there are issues of making it performant, of having some features on that. And the question is it really the best way to represent the whole of the web as RDF? Maybe yes, maybe no. So it's a difficult question. So in the end, I think it's pretty obvious that everything can be represented in RDF, but it's not so obvious whether it should.
The reason why I asked is, I mean, the Google search engine works on top of the semantic web and is able to deliver the source for information and by being context aware and aware of semantics and so on within milliseconds. Wouldn't it be a nice strategy or technology for Wikipedia too?
By turning more of Wikipedia's and our related projects data into structured information, we can unlock and unleash functionality that we currently don't have available. We can make things happen that are currently not happening. And there is a long way to go in exploring those possibilities. And I'm very much happy that actually the Wikimedia Foundation is working in this direction. We are trying to make more structured data accessible, editable, and reusable across our projects. And just the question basically is, how far does this go and how fast can this development go? So those are the two basic questions about it. Like, can we do everything by just turning it into RDF and making it accessible through a generic browser interface on top of the triple data? And how fast can we get to this place, and how fast can our technology catch up with this kind of requirements that we have in that case? And I think those two questions are the ones that have hampered semantic web adoption and application development with this thing in mind quite a bit over the last 20 years.
So, Denny, if we think at least 10 years or maybe even 15 years ahead, what is your vision on how Wikipedia will work?
I would very much hope that Wikipedia has become much more than it is today already. A crucial and essential infrastructure for knowledge in the world. I would hope that there would be many, many applications based on top of Wikipedia knowledge, and not only, as browsers over the whole of the Wikimedia universe, but even for applications to have, small parts of them being connected to the vast world of knowledge that Wikipedia provides. So that you can have, for example, a system that understands that there are the following cities in the county that you live in, and that can work on this intelligently. I would love that more and more of our tools become intelligent because they can actually connect into this knowledge infrastructure that is Wikipedia, and that can therefore act smarter based on this knowledge that is available to them. At the same time, what I think makes Wikipedia unique compared to the knowledge graph efforts of other companies and organizations is our openness and the fact that we can be edited by anyone at any time. I think it's crucial that this essential information infrastructure, this essential knowledge infrastructure is not only something that can be consumed by the world, it can be consumed by small organizations, by big organizations, by companies, by private people, and so on, but it is also something where everyone can come in and actually contribute to, that everyone can go in, fix errors, contribute information, build out more knowledge, shape the knowledge world, and to disagree with each other, to work on finding agreements together, to build this knowledge base that everyone can then reuse again and that everyone can contribute to. I think it is really important that we allow this two-way interaction with the knowledge base. And I think that's something that I would see a hard time happening if it's not happening with an organization like the Wikimedia Foundation, that it's really in its core a community-driven, a steward of the world's knowledge infrastructure.
How will you handle bad actors and fake news then? And how will you deal with defining what is true and what's not?
Wikipedia, and the same thing with Wikidata, has refrained from defining what is true. We don't record the truth. We don't say what is the one true capital of Jerusalem. What is the one true capital of Israel? We record what external sources are saying. We reflect the world of reliable sources and bring it together, but we do not decide what the truth is. If for example, there would be a contentious election, let's say in the US or in a different country, the Wikipedia contributors wouldn't go in and edit to, decide on who would be the winner of this election, but they would just reflect what the newspapers are saying, what the official authorities are saying, and weigh those. Even if they disagree, we would represent a disagreement. If they agree, we would represent disagreement. If they mostly agree and there's a little bit of weird voices disagreeing, well, we will take a measured approach towards it and see how weird those voices are. But in general, we are trying to reflect what reliable sources are saying about something and not to come up with our own truth. This has, I think, served Wikipedia very well. And this is the same spirit that I totally see continuing us in the movement, in order to reflect what the world is saying about things and not about defining truth.
How important is knowledge democratization?
If you had asked me that question 20 years ago, I would give you a very different answer. So even 15 or 10 years ago. So 15 or 10 years ago, I would have probably said something like, oh man, this is the best thing that could happen to humanity. It's basically, the final promise of the Enlightenment movement, that everyone can have access to all knowledge and that everyone can contribute to creating this knowledge. And this will lead to a more enlightened world, and we will agree on things, and we will be able to tackle the big problems effectively, and things like climate change and things like world hunger and so on. All of these things would go away because we would be able to actually work together on those, and because everyone can contribute to this knowledge, and there would be so many more voices contributing, so much more intelligence, so much more smartness coming together to solve those big problems, because we all understand the world the same and understand it better and so on. I still hope that 10 years, that 30 years old me is right. So that, but having seen the development in the world in the last 10 or 15 years, having seen, so the web brought this promise that everyone can share their voice, right? Instead of having a small set of publishers who filter the information and give it to the population, we now have a world where someone can tweet in Santiago de Chile, and it arrives within seconds in Tokyo, and it can become an important thing in the narrative of this particular day within minutes, and be all over the world, seen by 100,000 of us. And it doesn't matter who created this original thing. We are already at a point that we have democratized access to spreading information and knowledge in a way that would have been completely unimaginable 50 years ago, right? Or 100 years ago. So we are already in a very different world than we used to be. But is it a better world? Does this democratization have led to mostly positive outcomes, or does it have led to lots of disinformation. Did maybe the publishers that we used to have play an important role in filtering this information that we have now lost, and that now people are demanding from tech companies like Twitter and Facebook to take back those roles? And do we want a company like Facebook or Twitter to actually fulfill those roles instead of the traditional publishing houses who have been growing into these roles over centuries? And do we want now to give this power suddenly to companies who have been around for a decade or two, and who didn't grow up with this? I don't know. I don't know the answers to those questions, and I don't know if the world that we are in now has only benefit from the capability that everyone can contribute to it. On the other side, I want to believe that in the end, it is a positive overall outcome. I want to believe, and I totally believe that. And I think those are the growing pains, of changing into this new world where actually everyone can say everything, where status becomes less important, but we're not completely there yet. We're still in this change that is happening, and it's happening at the same time with the changes coming from things like AI and to a lot of social changes that are happening. And so the world will again be a very different place in a decade or two. And I very much want to believe that democratizing access to knowledge and knowledge creation is beneficial for the world at large, and that it will help us with diversifying the voices that contribute to our common set of knowledge that we have, that it will help towards getting a more comprehensive picture of how the world really is, not just filtered through the lens of a small but powerful demographic, for example. But this almost necessarily will go hand in hand with further painful changes. If you are a member of this powerful demographic, you will lose some of the power in order to share it more equitably with the rest of the world. And it will be painful for you. And even if you're not a member of that, you might go through changes that will still feel painful to you, even though they ultimately might benefit you and your status, because simply the world is unfair, and changes most often will be happening on the backs of those that are not powerful. And yeah, I don't have answers here. I just have worries. And I have beliefs. I strongly believe that democratizing power even further, democratizing access to knowledge, democratizing access to knowledge creation, to democratizing access to being a voice in the world is important, and that more equity will eventually lead to a better world, even though it might go through a phase of turmoil and pain for a while.
Do you think there is any way how we can use this amazing concept of full decentralization of knowledge gathering and aggregation and creation, and still somehow decrease the possibility of using all this social media and stuff to manipulate people, or as a weapon, or for things like disinformation and stuff like that? So do you see anything we could or should do in the next decades to preserve? I mean, knowledge for humankind, and passing knowledge is probably one of the most important things that distinguishes humanity from a lot of other species, right? And if we pervertize it, it might end very bad for us. So how do we make sure that democratizing knowledge stays a good thing and doesn't cause so many negative emotions?
I don't know the answer to that. If I would know the answer to that, I would be working on it. There are a few assumptions in your questions that I would like to question. So one of the things, for example, is that a lot of the knowledge that we didn't pass on in the past, because it was the knowledge of the underprivileged, it was the knowledge of the sidelined, it was the knowledge of those who were not in the beneficial demographic for some reason. A lot of the knowledge has been lost and had to be regained again and again. And I think we are already in a place where more of this knowledge is being created than it has ever been before. And insofar, we are probably on the right trajectory. What we don't know yet is how to effectively deal with this knowledge, how to reconcile it with the world that we are in. A lot of the structures that we have in the world, a lot of the institutions that we have in the world come from the old world, right? I mean, academia, newspapers, media, governments, all there are built on, have their roots in a history which is mostly defined by a small number of, a small part of the population. And at the same time, we are now spreading the possibilities to contribute to the world massively in order not to forget again, in order to pass more knowledge from everyone to the world. But those institutions might have inertia, might have bias coming from those places, and might have trouble with coping with those changes. And this is not to blame anyone in particular. These are structural, systemic issues, right, which are existing with those institutions, which are existing with those systems. And it's extremely difficult to imagine a world, to imagine a path forward where we can truly democratize our knowledge creation channels, but retain the structures that we have built coming from a previous world. Those structures have to change and will have to change in order to become more inclusive, to become more diverse, to become more connecting. And so if there's anything I think that we could do.
But is it really an issue that knowledge comes with a bias? Knowledge comes with uncertainty. Knowledge comes with being relevant or true only in a specific context. Knowledge is a partly matter of perspective. Do we really need to have a structure that resolves all the things, or would it be maybe even enough to just capture them and to make them accessible and traceable and transparent?
Yes, it's absolutely necessary to capture those biases, to understand those limitations of knowledge, and to actively consider those. You were saying it's really important to understand where the biases come from, for example, and you can just look, to even to the hard sciences like medicine, where we see that, for example, specific therapies or medicines have been tested only on a certain demographic, and then with the assumption that they will work for the other demographics just equally well, have been used for the other demographic without actually checking whether those assumptions are true. It would be crucial to record those biases when the data was collected. I'm not saying that data collection was a bad thing in the first place. I'm not saying that we shouldn't know this knowledge, but you're completely right. We have to capture the limitations as well. And this sounds nice, but sometimes you don't know what the limitations are beforehand. You don't know what you need to capture in order to make it then later filterable, in order to make it applicable to the given circumstances. If you don't even know what the dimensions of your possible biases are, how can you make this data later usable in order to debias it? This is extremely difficult. And if you're not lucky and have good insights into how to actually debias the data and make it usable, you might end up with using solutions which might work for a certain number of people, like in medicine, but might actually cause harm in another set of people. And this is dangerous. And there are no good solutions for that, because we don't know beforehand what the possible dimensions of biases are. And now we're talking about something like medicine, which in the end has kind of hard outcomes where you can see what's coming out. Now try the same thing with, for example, representing the history or the culture of a people, right? How would you even understand, how would you even capture whether the representation of the history of the Sioux, or the representation of the history of the Aborigines, or the representation of the history of Persia have certain effects on the world which are positive or negative? It's not like you have easy measurable things like in medicine where you see, oh, that person died, that person didn't. But are comparably easy to understand, and who owns the narrative of a country or a people, and what effect that has on the wider world. This is, I mean, we're getting to areas like, for example, in Asimov's book Foundation, where he has developed this whole theory of social engineering and history engineering. It's like we don't even have the methods to measure those things. We don't have the metrics to understand those changes. We are far away from having a theory of how this works. So it's extremely difficult to know what we should be doing today in order not to fall in those traps if we don't even understand those traps. It is important and good to worry about those big issues, but it's also very important to be able to dial that back and basically work on, and not forget, that things are in general, it seems, getting better, right? I mean, and we can do little changes that improve the situation, that seem to improve the situation, and we should be proud of those achievements. And we can't always think about the whole world and everything, and by focusing on small things that people agree on improves equity, and that allow more people to be part of knowledge creation and knowledge consumption and so on. I don't think we have to necessarily overthink that, whether this has some kind of fourth or fifth degree effect that might turn problematic at some point, but we can still get a bit closer to a world where everyone has a voice, where everyone has more access to power, and where everyone has more access to shaping the knowledge that we all rely on. And I think that's great. I mean, Wikipedia has already done so much in this direction, and we all can contribute to it, and this is already pretty awesome. So we shouldn't forget, the advancements that we already have done, and that we can go further than that. And I hope at some point people who are far smarter than me will then figure out how this all plays together in the larger picture, and then explain it to us. But until then, there's so much opportunity, and there's so much that already has been achieved, and I'm really, really happy to see where we are and how far we have come.